Hey, Adapters, welcome back. Today we have on Tom Bowman. Tom is an author and communication advisor to businesses and institutions such as NOAA, NASA, the National Academy of Sciences, and the Aquarium of the Pacific. He was the writing team lead for the USA Strategic Planning Framework. Tom has received statewide recognition for decarbonizing his business. Today, Tom and I will discuss climate policy in the Biden administration. Tom will provide his insights into how effective Biden's intention to create a whole-of-government climate strategy is. He emphasizes the need for a coordinated middle-out strategy that recognizes and supports diversity and society's capacity to innovate toward common goals. Hey, Tom, welcome back to the show.
Oh, it's great to see you again. Glad to be here.
Always a treat. We're going to have these ongoing discussions, and this is your second time, and I love chatting with you because I feel like I'm kind of getting an insider here. But for those who didn't see the first episode, could you give a little bit more background on yourself?
So I have been a communication practitioner, professional. I owned a exhibit design company for about 25 years, which I decarbonized. Along the way of owning that business, I took on a client with the National Academy of Sciences and was trained in what the science has to say about climate change by some of the leading experts in the world, really. And that really shifted my career focus. I started a consultancy to work on programs that are much larger and quite a bit different from exhibit design, and eventually passed that business on to my employees. And now I work with federal agencies and social scientists and others on innovative programs to try to help engage the public with solving these challenges that we face.
Okay, so when we first talked, the Biden administration, I think it was just a month or two into the first one, so we were sort of
Hmm.
still seeing what was going on. But let's
Right.
talk about those big moves. And so I wanted this whole government approach. John Kerry, very high profile person, coming on, I think, really thinking more internationally. But then Gina McCarthy, we all know Gina McCarthy from her days at the EPA. She's in charge of this domestic office. What does that all mean? How does that sort of represent what Biden's approach is?
It makes a couple of very big statements, first of all, on the international side, and they carve this up, domestic versus international. So to bring John Kerry in, who was the main negotiator for the United States on the Paris Agreement, at least at the end of the day, back into this project as the United States rejoined the Paris Agreement is really a sign to the rest of the world the United States is prepared to start negotiating tougher standards, tougher goals, and find ways to help the world achieve what the Paris Agreement asks for and what climate science really demands of us. And then his partner on the domestic side is Gina, and Gina's tasked with leading a federal White House task force that includes the heads of all the federal departments and agencies and others, and her own office to coordinate domestic climate policy. And what that is described as is a whole of government strategy. In other words, there's a role to play for every federal department, every federal agency. This won't just live at EPA or Department of Transportation or the Agriculture Department or the science agencies such as NOAA and NASA. Everybody is supposed to play a role. They've also convened and gotten a final report from what's called the WEJAC, the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, which is an outside council of climate justice leaders and environmental justice leaders who provided recommendations to the administration about how to invest in climate action in ways that are just and equitable. And they have a framework called Justice 40, which says that the administration's adopted, says that 40% of the spending on infrastructure and climate needs to be spent on disadvantaged communities, low-income communities, communities of color that have typically been left out of the game and have been suffering the worst impact. So it's a comprehensive and bold vision of how to do this. As you can imagine, they're busy staffing up, they're getting their feet under them, they're in the process of kind of getting all of this put together, and at the same time, negotiating this $1.2 trillion trillion-dollar bipartisan infrastructure bill and figuring out, how to handle the rest of it through budget reconciliation and all of those long, drawn out negotiations.
Well, okay, so you know this as well as anyone that a whole of government strategy is not easy to do because once you get into an agency
Right.
or department, it's like they have their own priorities. And this is, I guess, more insider baseball. My own experiences in the federal government is like the Council on Environmental Quality for some administrations is sort of the go-to area to do environmental policies. But then some administrations, it's ignored. They just like, okay, we're not going to listen to anything coming out of
Right.
here.
That's
I'm
right.
still curious. How does Gina McCarthy kind of fit in all that with that? Do you have a sense of really how she's able? Like, does everything have domestically has to come through her office?
That is an unanswered question,
Hmm.
as far as I can tell. Uh, Her office is meant to lead and coordinate, and that doesn't mean that the various departments and agencies don't have their own autonomy in all of this too. But, you know, Executive Order 14008, which was Biden's big climate response executive order, which he signed something like 21 days into his administration, calls on every agency to play its part in a number of specific ways. And part of Gina's job is to marshal resources and expertise across those agencies to help them all implement that. And while that's a role that OSTP, as you mentioned, the White House Office on Environmental Policy, has played that role in the past, but Biden has elevated this by appointing essentially a domestic climate czar, which we've never had before in Gina, and also establishing a White House task force that involves the heads of all the federal agencies and departments. It's, I mean, I sort of analogous to sort of a cabinet level integration of effort that Gina will lead, presumably lead and coordinate. Um, how that really will play out in the details is an amazing challenge to try to figure out. And there's a lot of hope that because Gina has so much experience at EPA and understands the intricacies of government so well on the executive side of things, that she'll be able to do better at this than just about anybody else could.
Well, what about the notion of so much of what needs to happen with climate change is on the mitigation side. Let's reduce our carbon emissions. But then
Right.
there's the adaptation side, which is obviously dear to my heart. It's what I did my career in. And do you have a
Right.
sense one or the other is kind of being favored, and not because there was sort of an intent to favor it, but we were sort of
Yeah.
discussing earlier. Maybe it's easier to get sort of the Republicans on board on the adaptation side. Have you had a sense of like, are they both getting the attention they
Right.
deserve?
Right. I'm seeing pieces of both. Biden very quickly reinstated the Clean Power Plan requirements on coal-fired power plants that they reduce pollution, and he has blocked um, uh, oil exploration in the Arctic wilderness and things like that. So some of those things speak to mitigation in a way because it reduces the capacity to use coal and to explore for oil. A lot of the rest of the mitigation work, though, would come through Congress with the infrastructure bill that builds out electric charging, that favors a transition to renewable energy on the electricity side, and to electrify the transportation system and to invest in making buildings and homes more energy efficient. So that is all mitigation focused, and it really largely hinges on what can get through Congress. The adaptation side is a really interesting thing because it's much more localized, much more decentralized. And so you have lots of federal agencies doing amazing amounts of work with farmers, for example, all over the country in different circumstances to help them adopt what's called restorative agricultural practices to reduce water use, fertilizer use, to reduce the amount of fertilizer that's running off into streams and rivers and causing dead zones in the ocean. Um, there's the hardening of infrastructure along the coasts. There's water conservation in the West and the South. There's all kinds of work to try to help make communities more resilient, to reduce the heat island effects in cities, all of those things. But the circumstances in which you do it are very local. And so there are myriad small programs scattered across the federal agencies that work with local actors, communities, um, uh, local groups, business associations, nonprofits, to figure out how to implement that stuff at the local level. What has never really happened before is a coordination of those efforts and a sort of more strategic approach to their financial support and resource support. And the hope is that in this administration, that kind of strategic alignment will start to happen. Um, Don't see signs of it yet, honestly, because and it's not clear to a lot of us whether there's an appetite for that. There seems to be, but whether the structures are getting in the way or whether they're just getting their feet on the ground and taking stock of where they are. It's not really clear yet.
Well, it seems like mitigation is really gonna take these national, international things, but adaptation, there a lot of that is local, and I think it's gonna test federalism big time because so much is local. And yet, I've lived in states where maybe one state isn't lifting a finger on anything when it comes to being more resilient, doing adaptation,
Right.
whereas a state maybe like California is just hitting the accelerator. And so the federal government has an interest that we don't want these sort of different contrasts and approaches, right?
They do, and they also have limitations on their authority. It's interesting hearing Biden's comments about the possibility of a universal mandate for COVID vaccine. And as a reporter asked him that question, he said, "Well, we're looking into what's legal for us to do." And that's a really important statement, right? Because because we have multi-jurisdictional government. So, and there are overlapping jurisdictions like crazy. So there are things that the federal, technically, or in the most simple terms, the federal government controls interstate activity, interstate commerce, interstate activity, generally speaking. But they make grants to states and they set rules for receiving federal money and they condition and they make investments in specific things here and there wherever they decide needs to be done. Or so it's not as simple as saying they only do interstate work. And then each state is free to do a lot on its own, and each municipality, each city or town can do a lot, or regional, there are regional planning bodies, agencies that manage the electric grid and water supply and all kinds of things. And so the web of actors and decision makers and collaborators in this work is very, very rich and in some place complex. Um, and nobody has control of all of it. That's just the nature of our system.
All right, on that, the COVID pandemic has really been fast. It's been a tragedy, but it's also been a fascinating approach to like what is the federal government willing to do? How are the states going to respond?
Yeah.
And for you, it must be fascinating and just okay, it's a test run. Like when we really have to get more
Right.
serious about climate change, we can't even do the pandemic right where people's lives are at risk, right? Like so much about climate change. I mean, you have a disaster here or there, but here is
Yeah.
this. It's really it's not encouraging in some ways, but in other ways, I think we've made some really great progress. But what have you kind of learned from the COVID approach that all right, we can't repeat this mistake here if we want to be successful on the climate side?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And I think we have to look at the history of the COVID pandemic in order to really see what the lessons are. One is that there was about a week in March last year when the world stayed home, right? The shift was instantaneous and universal because suddenly the world woke up to the fact that this is a deadly pandemic and people were afraid. They stayed home, they sacrificed their businesses and employment, and the governments of the world moved literally trillions of dollars to provide aid very, very swiftly. So what this says is that in a real crisis, in a moment of perceived crisis, people can move really, really quickly and with great unanimity to deal with a crisis. What's much harder is to deal with a crisis that is slow rolling and unfolding over a long period of time, the way climate does. And the scientists have always warned us that if we wait until that Pearl Harbor moment or that global pandemic moment where everybody reacts at once, we're well into a condition where the climate will always be changing. So let's look at some other things that happened in the pandemic. One is Operation Warp Speed, which I think is really important and telling because um, the federal government decided to produce a vaccine within a year, and no, as you know, that broke the record by threefold, fourfold. I mean, the previous record was 4 years to develop a vaccine. And in the process of developing three promising technologies, which turned out to be Johnson and Johnson, Moderna, and Pfizer, the federal government ordered huge quantities of those vaccines before they were even fully developed and tested, so that there wouldn't be this horrible gap between producing a vaccine and testing that it works, and then having to ramp up production that would take 6 months, a year, slow this rollout. So there can be investment ahead of time in something that's perceived to be important. And we do that kind of investment all the time. It just has to be perceived to be real. And then you get into the really complex human side, right? That early on, the encouragement to wear masks, to social distance, were always controversial, but in the majority of people took them seriously. And now the vaccine rollout has been, uh, um, it's been hit and miss. On the whole, what are we at? 69% or 70% of Americans have had at least one
One
shot.
shot,
That's
yeah.
a remarkable accomplishment in this amount of time. If you look at it from a glass half full point of view, the number of people who are diehards against it is about 14%, according to some polling that CNN published today. So so that means there's 14% of the public will probably never get the vaccine, and that means the rest, the other 15% that's in the middle, it seems to be gradually shifting towards getting it. For whatever the reasons are that they are reluctant to get it, there is movement, but it's very hit and miss. And the real problem, as you said, is that there are some states that, Louisiana, Texas, Florida, account for most of the new Delta variant infections, which is tragic for there. Um, and the rest of the country is much, much better protected because more people got vaccinated. Don't be surprised if we witness climate adaptation and mitigation working in exactly the same way.
Yeah, it has been fascinating following it. Well, pivoting back to climate change a bit, you have this notion of a middle out strategy, what do you mean by that?
What I mean is that a whole of government strategy is essentially still a top-down strategy if you look at it from a 50,000-foot view, right? The federal government will decide how it can help, what it can do. It will coordinate its efforts across all the agencies, and it's everything that Washington is capable of doing to help support climate action across the country. And then on the other hand, you have this bottom up wellspring of work that's going on all in communities all across the country. And that's everything from adaptation to mitigation activities. It's things happening in the marketplace, it's things happening in the corporate world and the small business world. It's communities deciding to decarbonize, to in, develop their own regulations, to buy their electricity from greener sources, to build seawalls, to harden their roads, to provide cooling centers. It's all the things that go into a climate response. And th- the amazing thing about that is that it shows that there's expertise and energy and creativity all over the country. The downside of relying entirely on that is that everybody's got to figure it out for themselves, right? And that means that it's cumbersome, it's not coordinated, and we don't really achieve the greatest collective impact. So what a number of people who were involved in this Action for Climate Empowerment framework project, for which Deb Morrison and I were the writers, is calling for what we call a middle-out strategy, which says there needs to be coordination between the top-down work and the bottom-up work. That is a more strategic way to engage and support and fund action by entities outside of the federal government, which means state and local governments, businesses, institutions, communities, to chart their future toward a lower carbon and more robust, resilient future for themselves in ways that make sense for them, but with coordinated support. Uh, and this is what the people who worked on ACE are calling for the federal government to help support, because in recognition that nobody can do it all, that we need, as Jonathan Kumi, who is an advisor to green businesses, said, we need to fail quickly, we need to learn quickly, we need to do more of what works and less of what doesn't work. And that requires marshaling shared collaborative work everywhere. And that's not something that the federal government has historically been terrific at doing. And so it's the kind of and it's not the kind of thing that the grassroots organizations have the capacity to do on its own. So we need to provide that backbone that helps people collaborate, learn quickly, share quickly, fail quickly, and share their results and move forward.
Well, speaking of grassroots, what's your sense? Like, what is the state of grassroots, like climate activism? And you'd mentioned climate justice earlier, but It's
Mhm.
almost its own entity, and so how it integrates into
Yeah.
the policy making apparatus. You would like to think, oh, we're all in the same boat, but it's not necessarily. What's your sense of the grassroots movement?
Yeah, it's interesting. We call it the grassroots movement, as you just said, and I don't experience it that way. I see it as a whole bunch of movements. So there are powerful movements for environmental justice, and the basic argument there, which is hard to disagree with, is that there can be no effective climate response and without climate justice, and there can be no climate justice without racial justice. And the idea, which is rock solid once you start working in this space, is that the people of color, people with lower incomes, live in places with more pollution, suffer already the greatest impacts of climate change. They have knowledge about how to solve climate change in their communities and make progress in their communities, but they tend to be left out of the large conversations. Even when there's investment in their communities, the money tends to go to outside white-owned big contractors who sort of helicopter in, hire some people temporarily, do some work, and then disappear. And rather than making investments in those communities to help build their economies so that they can be self-sustaining in a much more robust way. So that's their, we act for climate justice, even the NCAA, NAACP, a consortium of historically Black colleges and universities, all are working uh, with the White House and in a variety of different ways on those issues. And then you have the youth movement, the Sunshine Movement, and others that are working to pressure local politicians primarily um, to adopt, to support climate-friendly candidates, to support climate-friendly policies. My limited interactions with members of the Sunshine Movement is that a lot of those groups work kind of independently, and there is some coordination nationwide, but this doesn't have the energy or the sense of power that people felt in the civil rights movement in the 1960s or the anti-war movement in the 1960s. You're not seeing demonstrations all over the place. And then there's other kinds of activism that, there are the big established NGOs that do lawsuits to wrestle with local activities, local actions. There's the divestment movement that 350.org and Bill McKibben have been big players in, that is encouraging large scale investors to stop investing in fossil fuel industry in companies at all, so that their stock values plummet, so that they're less valuable as economic engines, and so that they have less power in our politics. Um, so I see this as multifaceted. When we say activism, it conjures up in me an ant farm of different activities going in different directions, all with a common goal, which is to shift us away from fossil fuels as quickly as we can.
Well, Tom, we've gotten to the end of the episode almost. It just flies by. I was just gonna
It
talk
sure does.
policy.
Seems like we just started.
You're right. And so I is to wrap this up. Like, what can we expect? Like, over the next 6 months. Within the Biden administration. What are you, I guess, hoping to see, or what can we likely see?
Yeah, I think we should look for how this bipartisan infrastructure bill is going to work its way through Congress, because it is a huge first step. And then look for people to be putting pressure on their representatives to not only support this, but to follow this up with a reconciliation bill that funds the other aspects of this that the bipartisan group couldn't get done, the sort of more human centric pieces. Um, Look also for the White House to start showing some signs that this whole of government work is coming to some fruition, meaning that we're going to start hearing about it. Modifications of programs, the federal budget that's for FY22 that's being negotiated now has huge plus ups in the budgets for federal agencies like NOAA and others to do much more climate related work. So keep an eye on where that goes. And hopefully, I think within the next 6 months, we're gonna find out whether the Biden administration, in its sort of honeymoon years before the next midterms, really has the power to accomplish on climate what the Obama administration couldn't, and no other administration ever has.
All right, Tom. I'm somewhat encouraged, even though there's always the cynic in me. But I think hopefully we'll get
Of
accomplished
course.
something in these 2 years. And I think they've hopefully learned from the Obama years. Those first 2 years, they didn't know, but that was where they're going to do all their big things. And so you
Yeah.
have to kind of think like that. But Tom, it's always a pleasure. I want to take you into just chatting, but thank you so much for what you're doing, and thanks for coming on and having this conversation.
My pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.
All right, we'll be right back.